Welcome, everyone, to the debut of the Health Z podcast, where the mission is to gather research data and boil it down to practical health tips for busy people like you. Today, we're diving into the science behind egg consumption and its impact on your health. We gathered several pieces of research, quite a few actually, and our goal is to understand what the current evidence really tells us, so you can make informed choices without getting, bogged down in all the scientific jargon.
Yeah, it's amazing how much debate there is around something like eggs, isn't it? Something so common. What we really see across these different studies is a real evolution in how we understand them. We're moving beyond just like simple cholesterol counts. We're considering a much wider range of factors now.
Exactly. Let's start by looking at a paper. It was published back in 2021 in the Journal of the American Heart Association. It's called Cardiovascular Harm from Egg Yolk and Meat, More Than Just Cholesterol and Saturated Fat. And this study, it really challenges the idea that we've been looking at the whole picture with eggs and meat. It focuses instead on some byproducts our bodies create when we digest them.
That's right. This research really highlights the role of our gut microbiome, the bacteria in our intestines, and how they relate to cardiovascular health. The authors, they point to findings where people swapped animal proteins, things like eggs and red meat, for plant-based proteins. They saw a significant drop in mortality, mostly from fewer cardiovascular events. And notably, they found a pretty substantial reduction in risk when plant protein specifically replaced egg protein.
Those numbers were quite striking, weren't they? A 24% decrease in risk for men, 21% for women, just by swapping out eggs for plant protein. The study also touches on how public perception might be shaped by, well, industry influence, which is always something to keep in mind when we look at food research, I think.
Absolutely. And they also clarify something important about dietary guidelines. Even though specific cholesterol limits were relaxed a few years back, the general advice, it's still to keep cholesterol intake as low as possible within a healthy diet. They really emphasize that when you eat dietary cholesterol alongside saturated fat, like eggs and bacon together, it can have a much bigger impact on your LDL cholesterol levels, your bad cholesterol.
Right, so that classic eggs and bacon breakfast may be more of a concern than just the saturated fat on its own.
Potentially, yeah.
And it's not just about the amount of cholesterol in our blood overall, is it? This paper mentions that atherosclerosis, the buildup in our arteries, it's more complex. They even point to a study where LDL cholesterol levels didn't really predict plaque progression very well. Things like age and, interestingly, kidney function were actually more telling.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Which suggests that kidney health and those gut-related byproducts we mentioned earlier, they could be playing a bigger role than we maybe thought. The paper also dives into what happens, in the hours right after we eat a meal high in fat and cholesterol, like one with eggs. They saw increases in LDL oxidation, that's the bad cholesterol becoming more damaged. They saw decreases in endothelial function, so the health of our blood vessel linings, and signs of inflammation in the arteries too, all for about 4 hours after the meal.
Wow, okay. That sounds like a pretty immediate impact after eating. And it seems this might be particularly relevant for certain people, right? The study points out the negative effects of egg consumption were more pronounced in individuals who developed diabetes, saying just one egg a day actually doubled their risk of coronary issues.
Yes, exactly. And a broader review of studies, a meta-analysis, also indicated a higher cardiovascular risk for people with type 2 diabetes who ate a lot of eggs. So it really suggests that those with existing metabolic conditions might need to be, well, more careful. The authors also remind us, that most Americans aren't eating what you call an ideal healthy diet, and they reference recommendations for a very limited intake of red meat and eggs, much lower than what people typically eat in North America, for instance.
That's interesting to compare that to places with different dietary patterns, too. Like the paper mentions Greece, where the Mediterranean diet is common, which tends to be lower in eggs anyway. And even there, they saw a link between egg intake and coronary risk in people with diabetes. And then there's that pooled analysis of almost 30,000 Americans showing that as people ate more dietary cholesterol and also more eggs, their risk of cardiovascular issues seemed to climb in a dose-dependent way.
Yeah, that's a pretty consistent finding in that paper. And the researchers specifically point the finger at the egg yolk, not the white. They explain the yolk is high in cholesterol, sure, but also in something called phosphatidylcholine. And our gut bacteria break this down into something called trimethylamine, or TMA, which then goes to the liver and gets converted into TMAO. And TMAO is the compound that's been linked pretty strongly to atherosclerosis development. They also note that carnitine, which you find in red meat, contributes to TMAO production as well.
Okay, TMAO. And this TMAO seems particularly harmful for people with kidney problems, including older adults, potentially speeding up kidney decline and increasing mortality risk.
That's what this paper suggests, yeah. And they even mention a linear dose response. The more eggs consumed, the greater the risk seemed to be in that population. The paper also highlights a connection found in multiple studies between eating more eggs and a higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes.
Hmm. Okay, so that's quite a lot of concern raised in that paper.
It is. But what's encouraging, perhaps, is that the paper mentions TMAO levels can actually drop quite quickly. Like within about a month, if people switch from red meat and eggs to white meat or plant-based protein sources, which might help explain, some of the cardiovascular benefits we often see with vegetarian diets.
Right, makes sense.
They also briefly mentioned that while red meat has more carnitine, all animal flesh has amino acids that can be converted into other potentially harmful gut byproducts, especially risky for those with impaired kidney function.
So the main takeaway from this specific 2021 paper seems pretty stark then. It suggests limiting or even avoiding egg yolks and red meat, and generally cutting back on meat intake, especially for older adults or those with kidney issues to help prevent heart disease and stroke. They're definitely pushing for a more plant-based diet.
That's the conclusion they reach, yes.
Okay. Now let's shift gears a bit and look at another study, also from 2021. This one's in the Journal of Food Science, and it's titled Egg Consumption and Health Effects, a Narrative Review. This one seems to take a maybe broader perspective.
It does, yes. This review starts by acknowledging that eggs are, a very nutrient-rich food. They provide high-quality protein, various bioactive compounds, things that lab studies suggest might have beneficial effects, immunomodulatory, anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, even potentially anti-cancer, or blood pressure-lowering properties.
Okay, so it starts from a more positive angle regarding potential benefits. It even mentions the idea that eggs might help protect against metabolic syndrome by improving good HDL cholesterol and reducing inflammation.
That's right. It presents that possibility. However, they also acknowledge the long-standing concern about the cholesterol content and its perceived link to heart disease. But a really key point they make is that there's actually insufficient evidence to definitively say that the cholesterol we eat directly leads to higher LDL cholesterol in most people. And they really emphasize that studies looking at egg consumption and the risks of CVD, diabetes, and metabolic syndrome have produced inconsistent results.
Ah, okay. So while that first paper seemed quite firm, this review is highlighting more uncertainty in the science.
Exactly. More nuance, more conflicting findings across different studies.
It does go into detail about what's actually in eggs, though, right? Breaking down the yolk versus the white.
Absolutely. They outline the vitamins, minerals, the high-quality protein, phospholipids, and those antioxidants we hear about, lutein and zeaxanthin. They also point out specific beneficial proteins found in both the white and the yolk, and their potential positive effects.
And then it talks about these bioactive peptides derived from egg proteins. These sound quite interesting potential to help with blood pressure, antioxidants, antimicrobials, even anti-diabetic properties.
It's quite fascinating research, yeah. The review discusses how some of these egg-derived peptides might influence blood sugar control by affecting certain enzymes. Now, when they look at egg consumption and metabolic syndrome specifically, they mention a study in Korea. It suggested moderate egg consumption, like 4 to 6 times a week or maybe one a day, might reduce the prevalence of metabolic syndrome. But interestingly, eating more than 1 egg a day didn't seem to offer additional benefits in that study.
Okay.
They also noted moderate egg consumption, less than 1 a day, in Chinese adults was linked to a lower risk of CVD, ischemic heart disease, and stroke.
So again, it seems like moderation might be a recurring theme here, and maybe the population being studied matters a lot too.
It certainly seems that way.
What about eggs and obesity? Does this review touch on that?
It does. It highlights the high protein content, which can help with satiety, feeling full, and potentially increase calorie burning a bit. They mention one study where eating, get this, 12 eggs a day versus an egg yolk-free replacement actually led to a decrease in an inflammatory marker, CRP, and an increase in adiponectin, a hormone linked to better metabolic health in overweight men.
12 eggs a day. Wow.
I know, quite extreme. But there's also other research linking higher egg consumption, maybe more like over 50 grams a day, in adults with a lower risk of central obesity and excess body fat, particularly in women.
So again, some potentially positive findings there, but when they discuss eggs and diabetes, it sounds like it gets murky again, echoing some of the concerns from the first paper.
Exactly. It's very mixed. The review mentions how components in eggs can affect blood sugar regulation, potentially positively. But when they look at the epidemiological studies, the population studies, they find really conflicting results on the link between eating eggs and the risk of getting type 2 diabetes. They suggest maybe differences in overall diets, lifestyle, socioeconomic factors could explain these discrepancies. And they make a really crucial point. Conditions like heart disease and type 2 diabetes are super complex. They're influenced by your whole diet, your activity level, your genetics, not just one single food like eggs.
That's such an important reminder, isn't it? Don't get too focused on just one ingredient. So, when it comes to the big one, eggs and heart disease, what's the general takeaway from this review?
Well, they point out that many clinical trials, where they actually have people eat eggs, generally haven't shown that egg intervention significantly worsens things like blood pressure, CRP, or body weight. In some cases, they've even seen potential improvements, like in good HDL cholesterol or decreases in some other inflammatory markers. So the overall finding they highlight from many studies is that egg consumption doesn't seem to clearly increase heart disease risk for most people. They also talk about the importance of HDL cholesterol in reverse cholesterol transport, clearing cholesterol out. And they note that eating egg yolks has been shown to increase HDL levels and also the size of the HDL particles, which is often seen as beneficial.
Right, bigger, fluffier HDL is generally considered better. The review also brings up that idea that maybe the quality and function of our cholesterol-carrying particles, the lipoproteins, are more important than just the raw numbers.
Exactly.
And since eggs often increase both LDL and HDL, maybe it kind of balances out.
That's one line of thinking, yes. They also mention that eating eggs can boost your blood levels of those beneficial antioxidants, lutein and zeaxanthin, without necessarily raising total or LDL cholesterol. Plus, eggs are a source of arginine, which helps blood vessel function, and choline, important for liver health and homocysteine levels. They even have some beneficial unsaturated fats.
Okay, so lots of potential positives mentioned here, but they do come back to that TMAO issue, right?
They do. They acknowledge its potential link to inflammation and atherosclerosis, which was, as we said, a major focus of that first JAJ paper.
But this review also mentioned some broader meta-analyses suggesting that eating maybe around one egg per day might actually be associated with a slightly lower risk of total stroke and isn't clearly linked to a higher risk of coronary heart disease.
Right. It really just illustrates the complexity and sometimes contradictory nature of the research findings. They acknowledge the official advice to limit dietary cholesterol, but they point to recent analyses suggesting that for healthy people, and maybe even those at risk for diabetes, eating somewhere in the range of 6 to 12 eggs per week doesn't seem to negatively impact major heart health risk factors. Although they do add a strong caution that differences between the studies' heterogeneity make it really hard to draw firm, definitive conclusions.
So, still some wiggle room there.
Definitely.
Right.
And they also bring up the possibility that phospholipids in eggs might actually boost HDL cholesterol levels and function, potentially slowing down atherosclerosis.
Okay. But then, just to keep it balanced, they do touch on some studies that have shown potential negative associations.
Yes, absolutely. They mention some research has linked higher egg consumption with other less healthy habits, like eating more red meat or having a higher BMI, which makes it hard to isolate the effect of just the eggs. Some shorter-term studies, like less than 12 weeks, showed a link between eating more than one egg a day and blood lipids. But that effect seemed less significant in people eating fewer eggs. There's also some indication that consistently eating more than one egg a day for longer periods, over 12 weeks, might slightly worsen the LDL to HDL cholesterol ratio.
Okay.
And one study did suggest a slightly higher risk of non-fatal heart attacks with eating 5 or more eggs a week, especially in people who already had diabetes or were overweight or obese.
Right.
But then, countering that, a large study in China found no link between egg consumption and overall mortality, though they did advise being cautious about excessive cholesterol from other food sources.
It really shows how much the findings can bounce around depending on the study design and the population.
For sure. And they even briefly discuss eggs and high blood pressure.
Another major risk factor for heart disease.
Right. They mention the potential for those antioxidant peptides in eggs to improve blood vessel function. Some animal studies showed blood pressure lowering effects from egg white components. However, a large human study in 2020 did link higher cholesterol intake and also egg consumption to a greater risk of developing high blood pressure later on, with kind of a non-linear relationship for eggs up to about 7 per week.
Interesting.
But again, a broader meta-analysis couldn't really provide a definitive answer on eggs and blood pressure because the studies had limitations.
Okay. So that brings us to that short piece from 2022 just titled, Does Eating Eggs Matter?
Yeah.
Based on everything we've just discussed, the answer seems to be a definite yes, but the how and for whom is still, well, being debated quite a bit.
That sums it up pretty well.
Yeah.
And then we also noted the egg consumption and health outcomes, a global evidence mapping review. We don't have all the specifics from our excerpts, but the title itself suggests it's trying to give a very broad overview of all the systematic reviews out there looking at various health outcomes. It confirms it's a big topic.
Right. And finally, that general overview piece, eggs, health benefits, risks, and dietary considerations. It seems like that one just tries to distill the main points of this whole debate we've been having.
Exactly. It reiterates the key points. The cholesterol and heart disease risk debate, the nutritional pros versus potential cons, and crucially, how individual health status matters. Their overall conclusion is pretty much where we're landing. Eggs are nutrient-dense, good protein, essential nutrients, and moderate consumption seems generally acceptable for most people. But, and it's important, but individuals with specific health conditions, especially cardiovascular ones or diabetes or kidney issues, really should talk it over with their healthcare provider.
Okay, so let's try and pull all this together. It's clear the science around eggs is, well, complex, sometimes contradictory even. Eggs definitely offer valuable nutrients, high-quality protein, vitamins, those antioxidants, but concerns remain, particularly for certain individuals, and definitely within the context of the overall diet. You can't look at eggs in isolation, and it really seems our understanding is shifting, right? Moving beyond just cholesterol to think about gut health, TMAO, inflammation, particle size, all that stuff.
That's a great summary. So thinking practically, what does this mean for you listening? Based on what we've discussed, for most generally healthy individuals, eating eggs in moderation, maybe around one a day, give or take,
Yeah?
seems perfectly acceptable and can definitely be part of a nutritious diet.
Yeah, and how you prepare them probably matters too, right? Maybe pairing them with veggies, whole grains, avocado, rather than, say, heaps of bacon and processed sausage. That seems like a smarter approach based on this.
Absolutely. Think about the whole plate. And if you do have existing heart conditions or diabetes or known kidney problems, it's really worth having a specific conversation with your doctor or dietitian about your egg intake. The research does suggest more caution might be warranted in those cases. That first paper was pretty clear on that.
It also seems really important to look at your diet as a whole picture. If your diet is already heavy on other animal products, lots of saturated fat, lots of cholesterol from other sources, then maybe you need to be more mindful about adding lots of eggs on top of that. A diet pattern that leans more plant-based generally seems to come looking beneficial for heart health across the board here.
That's a very consistent message, yes. And it's probably worth keeping an eye on the newer research too, especially the studies looking deeper into gut health, those metabolites like TMAO. And if you have specific concerns based on your health history, definitely discuss them with your doctor.
So thinking about all this, given this evolving understanding of how even a simple food like an egg interacts with our unique biology and gut microbiome, it makes you wonder what other seemingly simple dietary choices might have more nuanced, complex effects on our long-term health than we currently appreciate. Something to think about. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you can join here again next time.